Hi, first grade. I hope you're having a great Friday today. Today we are going to talk a little bit more about fairy tales. This is what we are learning for our IB planner. And some of the things that we are noticing in fairy tales is some of the elements that you can find in a fairy tale or that the fairy tale has. So some of the things that you might notice in fairy tales are kind of listed on this poster here that we've been looking at each week. So one of the things that's kind of a big one in fairy tales is you always have a good character and a bad character. So that is something that you might notice in several fairy tales, is that it's kind of good versus evil. It has some of that in the fairy tale. The other thing that you might notice is royalty and poverty. So kings, queens, princesses. Also, sometimes there's people who don't have much money who are poor, and that's what poverty means. So just the kind of the difference between people who do have a lot of money and then the people who don't have as much money. You might see magic. There might be a magic wand, or maybe there's a fairy godmother who can cast a spell. Those are things that you might notice in a fairy tale. Castles would kind of go with that royalty piece. Problem and solution. This is what we're learning about in fiction writing too, that sometimes the characters get into trouble and then eventually the problem gets solved. And one of my favorite parts about fairy tales is they typically have a happy ending, and I like things that end in a happy way. So that's one of my favorite parts about fairy tales. They will a lot of times start with once upon a time. So you might notice that in some stories we read. I wonder if today's story will start that way. We'll look and see. Personification is something we have talked about a few times now, where the author gives an animal or a different type of character some human-like qualities, even if it's not a human. So for example, this could be like a mouse who wears clothes, or it could be a bear who knows how to talk, or it could be maybe just a bunny rabbit that can cook. Those are things called personification, where you're taking an animal and you're giving it some human-like characteristics. So we might notice some of that in a fairy tale as well. We've talked about this one a couple of times, groups of three little pigs, Goldilocks and the three bears. For some reason, fairy tales just sometimes have a group of three. That's something that you might notice. They're always set in the past, so that's why you might say a long, long time ago, or way back when, things like that. Just they're set from a long time ago. They're going to be make-believe, and they're going to have elves, dwarves, giants, wizards, sometimes, not all the time, but that goes a lot with make-believe. Some of those things that are pretend or made up, you might have some of those kind of made up pretend characters in a fairy tale. And then the big thing that we're trying to learn from fairy tales is, what is the lesson? What's the value? A lot of times you'll hear me say that this is the author's purpose or the author's message. What is the author trying to teach us? They're trying to teach you a story, and so, or a lesson. And so they want you to read the story and then think about it. And you have to kind of think in a deeper level about, what is this author's message? What is the author trying to teach me here? So we're going to read today The Princess and the Pea. And I'd like to, at the end of the story, think about, what was the purpose of that story? What was the author trying to teach us? And what was the message or the lesson or the value that we can learn from The Princess and the Pea? And then we'll also look and see if there's any of these other things. I think that there's some royalty in this story. I think there's a castle in this story. I think there's good versus evil in this story. So let's take a look and listen to this story together, and then we'll figure out some of those elements in this fairy tale. All right, so The Princess and the Pea. All righty. The Princess and the Pea. I can already see some royalty in this story. So I can tell that that looks like somebody who has royalty because of their crown. Maybe that's the queen or the princess. Let's read to find out. Once upon a time, there was a prince who wanted to marry a princess. She had to be a real princess, though. The prince looked all over the world, but he couldn't find who he wanted. Many young women said they were princesses, but were they really? It was hard to know for sure. There was always something about them that did not quite seem right. So the prince came home again and was sad. He still wanted to find a real princess to marry. One evening there was a terrible storm with thunder and lightning. The rain came down hard as the wind howled. Suddenly, someone knocked at the castle door. A young woman stood outside. She said she was a princess who had been caught in the storm. But what a sight the rain and wind had made her look! The water ran down from her hair and clothes. It ran into the toes of her shoes until they overflowed. Still, she said that she was a real princess. We'll soon find out, thought the old queen. She went into the bedroom and stripped all the bedding off of the bed. She took a pea and laid it on the bare bed frame. Then she took 20 mattresses and placed them on top of the pea. Finally, she put 20 blankets stuffed with goose feathers on top. On this night, the princess had to lie all night. In the morning, the queen asked her how she had slept. "Oh, very badly. I barely closed my eyes all night," said the princess. "Goodness knows what it was, but I was lying on something hard," she added. "I am black and blue all over my body. It was horrible," she cried. Now they knew that she was a real princess. She had felt the pea right through 20 mattresses and 20 goose feather blankets. Nobody but a real princess could be that sensitive. So the prince married her, for now he knew that she was a real princess. The pea was given to a museum. You can still see it there if you like. All right, and there's a glossary. There were some maybe tricky words in there. Remember, the glossary can help you solve some of those tricky words. All righty, so in this story, there were some of those elements. We definitely had royalty in this story: king, queen, prince, and a princess. So those are some of those royalty elements that you might see in a fairy tale. This one had a very happy ending. The prince was able to find his princess who he had been looking for. The problem was that he couldn't find a princess. And then the solution to the problem was that this princess came along and they were able to find out if she was a real princess by having her sleep on a pea. That would be kind of funny if somebody really noticed a tiny little pea in their bed, huh? So, happy ending, problem, solution, castles, royalty. No, not really any personification in this one because all of the characters are real people. So there wasn't any animals or anything like that in this story. What do you think was the author's purpose of this story? Why do you think the author wanted us to learn, or what could we learn from this story about the princess and the pea? I'm wondering if maybe it is that we should always tell the truth, and maybe we should believe people when they're telling us the truth, because the prince and the queen didn't really believe that the princess was actually a princess. When she told them that she was, they made her sleep on a pea to figure out the truth. Maybe that could be the message. I don't know. Maybe you have a different idea for what the message is. One of the things about finding the message in the story is that you kind of have to use your own judgment. You might be making an inference using clues from the story, and then you're kind of making that decision on your own. So take some time and think about what you think the author's purpose was in writing this story. What's the author trying to teach us? What can we learn from the princess and the pea? I hope you are all having a great day and that you enjoyed this story.